Welcome. Welcome to the 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act virtual pilgrimage. My name is the Reverend John Borthwick, and today in episode 2, I want to talk a little bit about why I'm using some of the terms I'm using, and it'll also connect to the book as it sets the stage for this journey that we're on. So the first thing I want to just talk about is, what is this pilgrimage idea? And essentially, as I understand it, and it's something that's existed for many centuries, millennia even, people make these decisions, human beings, to walk from one place to another, to go on a journey that might take them from one place where they are to another place. And during the pandemic, I decided to connect with a book called Me and White Supremacy by Layla Saad, and crafted that as a kind of virtual pilgrimage. The idea of walking in someone's footsteps, encountering something maybe that you wouldn't generally encounter before, and finding the experience kind of life-changing, finding that you're coming away from that experience looking at the world a little differently. And that's essentially what a pilgrimage has been from a spiritual perspective for a really long time. And so last year I did a whole series on the Me and White Supremacy virtual pilgrimage. This year I decided that I was going to connect a little more with conversations around reconciliation and justice in our relationship with the Indigenous community. And it seemed like an accessible engagement in that conversation to talk about 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act by Bob Joseph. So how am I framing this? Now, if you've watched the first episode already, you'll find maybe you were a little confused or thought it a bit odd that I would reference Braveheart. What a strange thing to reference as a part of this conversation. What I'm trying to do for my own personal journey is make those connections with my own self, my own connections from a cultural perspective, my ancestry. And so I am half Scottish and half Canadian. And the community I serve, the Presbyterian Church in Canada, sees itself as a part of its founding as directly connected to Scotland. It has a lot of Scottish heritage. St. Andrew's is literally a patron saint of Scotland. The blue background and the white cross that's very common that you'll see pasted everywhere in Scotland, a part of Scottish heritage. It's a big kind of thing. And so I'm going to try and provide some illustrations and parallels to the material that we're reading with the ancestry that I know about, my connection point to that. Because I'm hoping that as we do this pilgrimage together, it'll give folks that are listening and watching a sense, a feeling, an idea of walking in the shoes of the other, and the other being the Indigenous experience or reality. And trying to make those connections of how would that feel? What would that be like if myself, as someone who comes from Scotland, had some of these kinds of things that we're talking about imposed or put upon or directing who they were as a person on a daily basis or as a part of their lives. And so that's why I'm going in this direction, and I hope you'll join me for that kind of parallel. And if you're not Scottish or don't have that kind of background, I hope that you'll make that extrapolation. You'll take that in a wider sense of what would it be like to experience the world as somebody who many things are being put upon them as a people, as a person. What would that feel like for you if that's not been your experience thus far of living? Now, Bob Joseph in his book starts to also clarify some terms, especially the label Indian. And some, I'm sure, if you watched the first episode, might even be bristling at the use of the word Indian in today's context of 2022. I know I bristle against it a little bit here and there as well, as I hear my, the older generation, my parents and others, use Indian fairly liberally as a way of defining a people. But as Bob clarifies, it also has a legal and historical context that needs to be recognized. I've heard members of the Indigenous community say that Indian is a necessary word because it's been used to define a people, and it gives them a certain status as a way of navigating this country of Canada and the government and the systems. It's a definition that was tied way back in the 1870s to some kind of genetics, being born within an Indian community. And even though it was revised in 1951 to open the definition a bit more, it was about this. It says, a person who pursuant to the Act, the Indian Act, is registered as an Indian. Now, the fact that someone must register as an Indian in order to receive rights in this country, privileges, benefits, whatever that might be, or as a way of navigating this country, should really give us pause, and maybe intensify that desire to see this act dismantled. I can't think of other cultural communities in this country who have to literally register as a certain defined genetic group of people in order to receive benefits, in order to receive some kind of status in this country. Now, some other terms that we'll hear used are things like First Nations. That originated in the 1970s in its usage. Indigenous peoples seems to be the more commonly phrase used now at this time. It seems to pull together a variety of different communities. But you'll also hear First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples as a sort of collective as well. And we use that as our land acknowledgement for St. Andrews in Guelph. Now, the Canadian government was using for a season the term Aboriginal, and because of that, you'll also find, if and when we talk about the Presbyterian Church in Canada's confession to Aboriginal peoples in Canada, because that at that time was the appropriate word, you'll see that for a season that was the other term that was used, and Indigenous became the new word around 2016. Now, Bob says within that chapter around terms to hang in there, not get, in a sense, don't get bogged down with all these terms and how we use them. But I do want us just to sort of sit with this for just a second as we're journeying on this pilgrimage. Just to think about it, that another people with power, authority over someone else, a group of people, say, they get to define, they get to create a term, they get to say what a group of people is called in a country, in a place, in a space. So whether it's Indian, Aboriginal, or Indigenous, these are the terms that another people have said, that's who you are. And think about it a little more for those who've been around for a while. You'll also hear words that became commonly used for Indigenous groups. You might hear in this community in Ontario in Canada, a group of people called Huron or Iroquois. And would it maybe surprise you to know that the word Huron and Iroquois are actually derogatory words for a peoples that came from the people who colonized, the French, who were colonizing this area of Canada. I'm sure the English had their iterations as well. But for Huron, say, for example, as we understand it, it comes from the French word that means rough or ruffian. A whole people named ruffians. Sort of like in imperial times, Roman imperial times, the idea of barbarians, which literally meant people who had beards, you know, shaggy people. I would assume in today's culture of so many beards and long hair that this world would be filled with barbarians if a Roman centurion turned up from way back in the 1st century. But way back in colonizing times of Canada, the colonizers used, the French, the English used a term like Huron that's really a derogatory term in French for a group of people. And then for Iroquois, that's literally a put down by the Huron people towards the people who they knew as they called them Iroquois, but essentially it's a French garbling of that word that really means like snake or adder or kind of, again, a put down for a whole group of people. They were, you know, fighting against each other or were adversaries from time to time, these peoples, and they had a name for the people that they were in an adversarial relationship with, and that's how they defined them, and that's how the colonizers took on that name. And then forever, in a day, that's how a whole people were defined. by how their enemies defined them, by a word that's literally a put down. I can remember working in Dufferin Mall in Toronto, and I was unique in the sense of the place where I worked was filled with people from Italy, Portugal, Spain. That was the common region, Mediterranean, Greek. And for myself, I was often referred to, literally as someone would walk into the store I worked at Dufferin Mall, someone whom I didn't know would look at me and ask me if I spoke Italian, Portuguese, Greek, Spanish, something of that nature. And if I said no, they would say, ah, manja cake. Manja cake was what I was called often. Now, like, don't feel bad for me. It was just what I was called, and it essentially means cake eater. It's a Mediterranean or European way of referring to people who come from the island of Great Britain, or that area of Great Britain, England, Scotland. Manja cake, cake eaters, that's who you are. Imagine having to bear that all the time. Imagine if that's what we were called all the time. Well, you're the cake eaters, that's who you are. Well, that's exactly what's happened to Indigenous communities throughout our country from the day they first met the colonizers. I'll make one last connection to my Scottish heritage. When I was dating and then getting married to my wife, who is English, was born in England as a part of Great Britain, but let's be clear, there's Scotland and England. There's these weird sort of notion of several countries within a country. Some in my family who were Scottish said, couldn't you have found a nice Scottish girl, John, instead of some Sassenach? Sassenach. Now, for many people, they'd be like, Sassenach, what does that even mean? And it's a word that, probably in its early origin relates to a group of peoples called the Saxons, people from Saxony. But it's a word that's been brought up a level within the history and heritage of the relationship between England and basically the rest of Great Britain, that it's a way of putting down the English. You'll see it and hear it in some shows that relate to that ancestry and heritage. So in some cases, when someone would say the word Sassenach, it was even considered like a rude word. It doesn't have any deeply seated rudeness to it. It literally means that people who are from a certain area. But it's become a way of disparaging, dismissing, othering a whole group of people called the English. So as I wrap up, I'm thinking to myself that, as much as this is just a conversation about the terms we use or definitions we have, I think it should raise up for all of us a sense of the political nature of how that's used to call us, to identify us as people by those in power. It's the idea of that another group of people gets to say, well, this is what we call you. This is the word we use for you people. It's incredibly supremacist, incredibly paternalistic, incredibly, I don't know, it's wrong. And I hear it in the sentiments that are expressed where people will be like, well, that's just the word we used for those people. That's what we referred to them. We don't know. What's wrong with that? And I hear in a certain spaces that I occupy, the ideas around of, well, I just don't know what to call these people anymore. How do I even define them? What word do I use for those people? And maybe the simplest transformation that we need to hear today is, what would it be like to be called by a name that someone else chose for you? And maybe instead, what would it be like if we asked the other what they would like to be called? What is their name? I've heard stories over the years of people who immigrated to Canada, and as they gave their names at the dock or wherever they were entering Canada from, the person sitting at the desk couldn't fully understand their name, didn't know how to spell it, weren't sure about it, and so they literally changed their name. And I remember having a conversation one time with one individual saying, I've seen so many different spellings of your name. How do you spell it? Yeah, it doesn't matter. They're all good. It felt within that, and as I heard the story over time, there's a sense of pain and disconnection, a devaluing that's happened by a community of people who said, I can't pronounce your name, you're just going to be called this. I'm just going to write it this way. How does somebody else get to choose that for you? And it seems like that's the concept we still need to learn. What if we were to accept how people wanted to be identified, that they wanted to be called? We just accepted that and just went with it. I'm sure it's something that we'll return to again as we continue this journey, this virtual pilgrimage with the 21 things you may not know about the Indian Act. I'm glad to have your company along the way.